So,
Sure.
well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Did everybody receive a copy of the class outline for today?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. If you did not receive one, could you raise your hand? Oh, perfect. I knew there would be a few.
Here.
Oh,
I
thank you.
can do this. As much as you can.
All right, so today we are in Judges chapters 10, 11, and 12. That's 3 chapters, so it's pretty expansive, but 10, 11, and 12. We're 10, 11, and 12. And so last week we studied the story of Abimelech and his rise and fall of power. And so just to kind of help us review, can somebody tell me who was Abimelech? Who was Abimelech? Son of somebody, right?
His name is my father's a king, right?
Right. He's the son of Gideon, and his name actually means my father is a king. Who is his mother?
A queen.
Not a queen. Yes, she was a prostitute, a concubine is the nice way the Bible says it. She was a concubine in what city? Shechem, yes. So she was a concubine in Shechem. So Abimelech's father was the judge Gideon, and then his mother was a concubine in Shechem. And so, how did Gideon rise to power? What kind of angle did he take? There were 2 important things he did. I'm sorry, Abimelech. Yeah, Abimelech.
He wiped out his brothers.
He wiped out his brothers, right? And then what did he do before he wiped out his brothers?
He got the scoundrels to support him.
He got the scoundrels to support him, exactly. And so he went to his fellow uncles and was like, hey guys, is it better for the 70 to rule over you or the one who is actually of your blood? And so they said, no, we like the one that's of our blood. And so they gave him coins, or not coins, but silver from the temple of Baal. And then he went to get scoundrels and then killed his brothers. So the next part of that story is he was coronated as king. And what happened at his coronation service? Do you remember?
Half brother showed up on the hill.
Yeah. Little brother showed up on a hill. All right. What hill did he show up on? The one on the left. Yeah. Right. Visual learners. Yes. Mount Gerizim. And so when we talked about this last time, what was unique about these 2 mountains?
Gerizim was a proclamation of blessing.
Yeah.
And was curses.
Right. So I'll just keep it on this one. So you have Shechem here in the middle, and this was supposed to be the proclamation of blessings. This is the proclamations of curses. And we learned that this is actually, if you stand here in the middle, that's a natural amphitheater. So if somebody's on this mountain, you hear him here, and you also hear him on the other mountain on the other side. And so Jotham gets up, he pronounces this parable. And what does he tell us from the parable? What does he tell us about Abimelech in the parable?
Thorn bushes.
Yeah, thorn bushes. Bramble, yep. So he says all the trees get together. The olive tree doesn't want to be king. The fig tree doesn't want to be king. The vine doesn't want to be king. So we're left with the bramble. And so as a result of that, the proclamation he gives to them is to say, well, if you've honored Gideon and his family in the way that you think you should have, and it brings honor to the family, then everything will be fine. And I'm going to proclaim blessings on you again from the mountain. But if you did not, then let fire come from Abimelech into Shechem to consume you, and let fire from Shechem come onto Abimelech and consume him. And so that was kind of the parable as well as the curses that was mentioned. And so in the text, we learn how long did Abimelech actually rule? Yeah, not very long. About 3 or 4 years, right? And then after 3 years, what do we learn? The Spirit of God comes and causes this division because people begin to rob others on the highway. And
the
so,
woman crushes him with a rock.
yeah, yeah. And then a woman crushes him with a rock.
You gotta watch out for those women.
I'm telling you, man.
Yeah, yeah.
They get into your head.
Oh,
Same thing with sister.
he said, you gotta watch the women that get into your head. Yeah, and so I didn't have this picture last time, but before we go forward to the bashing of the heads, or the head, what happened is you had Gaal come into Shechem, and then he unites the Shechemites against Abimelech, and then Abimelech with his governor comes into Shechem, controls it, takes control of it, and then what he does is and so what then he does is he takes over the town, and then he proceeds to the tower in Shechem, and he burns that down. And so now we see the cursed field, Shechem will be consumed by the fire of Abimelech. And then afterwards, Abimelech goes to the next town. He tries to do the same thing. And one woman had a great idea, right? And so you see her with the millstone dropping it on her. Now, this is what a millstone looks like. Some of you, this may be difficult to see, and I understand that. But a millstone, as we talked about last time, is a grounding rock. So you would put grain inside of here, and you would just take this stone and just kind of move it all the way around. And you would kind of thresh the grain, if you will. And so what she did was she took this big, huge boulder thing and threw it and hit him on the head. Yeah, that's a power lifter there. And so, yeah, that's a good aim. Yes,
Marquise, I think it was in the Bible, not in this book, it says that, because it's shameful to be killed by a woman, he begged one of his men to
to kill him.
stab him. So who really killed him?
Right. So this is what we talked about last time. As soon as he got his head split open by a woman, he then said to his armor bearer, hey, look, kill me so that they won't say I died from the hands of a woman.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to preserve his honor. But the crazy thing is, I think we learned in 2 Samuel, it was that when they remembered the story, when Israelites later remembered the story, they remember that he was actually killed by a woman.
Apparently, social media was very active.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the story of Abimelech and what we looked at last time. We talked about how we have to be careful about our beliefs because it leads to our actions. And because Abimelech thought that he should be king, but he really wasn't in the right line for that. And so today, what we're going to look at are 5 minor judges, and they're called minor because a lot is not spoken of them. And then we're also going to look at the story of Jephthah. Is that all right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so as is our custom so far in the classes, at the bottom right of your handout for today are some extra biblical sources or other biblical sources. And then in the left is a section for you to write some key verses or key topics as we go through the study that you would like to remember or to jot down. And so the first judge that we learn of is Tola. And it says, after the time of Abimelech, chapter 10, verse 1 in the book of Judges, a man of Issachar named Tola, son of Puah, the son of Dodo, rose to save Israel. These are quite some names. And he lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel 27 years, then he was died and buried in Shamir. So this is all that we read about this judge who ruled for 20-something years. And so if you look at your map, Tola is from, in this area, West Manasseh. And all that we learn about this judge is that he was born in Issachar, his grandfather, and you know what? He lived in the hill country of Ephraim, led Israel for 20 years, and that was all we know about him. It's interesting, though, when you look at this name, Tola, There is other biblical sources of that name. So Genesis 46 and 13, kind of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his descendants who went into Egypt. One of the sons of Issachar, the name was Tola as well as Pua. And then in Numbers 26:23, when a census was conducted by Moses and Eleazar, which was the son of Aaron, we see before they went into the wilderness, we see there in verse 23 of Numbers 26 that the descendants of Issachar by their clans were through Tola, the Tolite clan, and through Pua, the Purite clan. And so what this is saying is that this person here is connected probably to that lineage. And as was tradition then, and in some cultures now, you name your firstborn child after the ancestor. So all firstborn male sons may have the same names. Now, that's still something that actually exists today. And so that's kind of all that we know about him. You know, there's only 2 verses are given about Tola, and that's why he's a minor judge. And then the text draws our attention to Jair, which is verses 3 through 5. And it tells us that Tola was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Habat Jair. And when Jair died, he was buried in Canaan. So we get a little bit more information in this one. Yes, sir.
On the case of these 2 judges, there's much information on, but they both said they judged Israel as a group.
Right.
How large an area, how great a number of tribes might it have been?
I mean, honestly, we really don't know. The text doesn't make us aware of that. And this is one of the things that we began to discuss in the first class is we will see language of all the judges that they judged Israel. Even when we talked about Abimelech, right, and his rise to power with the Shechemites, he ruled over the Israelites. So all the Israelites were with him, etc. And so the author is using this general language to really refer more so to territorial battles. And we learned that through the first class because of the way the years line up. So we have a smaller time frame in years in comparison to the aggregate total years mentioned in the book of Judges. And so that lets us know that not all the judges ruled all of the territory. And we even see that in the story of Deborah and Gideon. Not all of the tribes gathered together to support them. And so it's my assumption that he probably was just a local tribe leader in that area. Yes,
So there was 45 years of kind of peace during that time?
Yep.
That's a long time.
that is a long time. 45 years of peace. And with these people who ruled for 23 years, we don't know anything about them.
I
But
wonder why that is.
right.
Because they apparently give peace while there's
Yeah.
not more said about them.
That's a good question. So why do you all think that nothing is written about these 2?
Boring.
Yeah.
Kind of a boring time.
Yeah.
That's good.
You're right.
You know, it kind of reflects, it's so funny to me when I think about this, but it kind of reflects the news stories in today's news. It's only really news and worth mentioning if it's kind of bad because it gives you a story. You know what I mean? You don't cut on channel. Yeah, you don't come on channel 2 or channel 11 or 13 and at 10 o'clock and see all the good stuff that happens in the world. You see some of the negative stuff more often than not. And it is huge, exactly. And so it's interesting though, because the difference between Tola and Jair is that there's more mention about Jair. And what do you all think about the fact that he had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys? When you read that, what do you think about it? Yeah. Yeah, he was pretty rich. He was pretty well off.
He was busy at night too.
Busy at night, that's another way to think of it. And so, for all of your sons to have their own personal donkey shows his wealth. Now, that word there, Habat Jair, and so when it says they control 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Habat Jair, this is kind of a play on words from the Amorite language. And that first word, Habath, It's in the Amorite language, Hawa, which means like a cluster of tents or village. So all this language stuff is just to tell you that these are probably little villages or tent villages or things of that nature. But they each kind of had probably their own little territory that they were ruling. And so, even though not a lot is written about them, one commentator said that many a man would like no better epitaph than that he rose to deliver Israel. Too many men and women have written after their names the record of their destructive works. And Wiersbe kind of picks up on this, taking it a step further on page 110. And he says, for 45 years, the people of Israel enjoyed peace and security, thanks to the leadership of Tola and Jer. They enjoyed 45 years of peace and prosperity, but didn't take time to thank the Lord for what he had done for them. The essence of idolatry is enjoying God's gifts, but not being grateful to the giver, and Israel was guilty of this. And he makes this note because right there in chapter 10, verse 6, we read again, Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So after 45 years of peace and prosperity, probably not a lot happening that's worth mentioning, the people again forget the ways of their God. And so then we're introduced into the story of Jephthah. And notice here the cycle repeats. Yeah, the cycle repeats. We haven't seen this since the time of Gideon, pretty much, because there was no mention of the cycle in Abimelech. And so the cycle repeats itself, and it says, again, Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. They served at least 7 gods, is what the author is trying to draw our attention to. Yeah. So previously, it's interesting because previously you may hear about 1 or 2 idols, the Baals of this or the Moabite god this, but here the sin is so great that there's 7 gods that I mentioned. Now, if you jump down to verses 10 through 12, it becomes interesting because this is what God says. The Lord replied in verse 11, when the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, and the Amalekites, and the Meunites oppressed you, and you cried to me for help, did I not save you from their hands? It's interesting because when you look at what's going on, they served 7 gods at the time of Jephthah, but God had already delivered them from 7 gods before. And so it's like God helps them to remove idols and oppression, but then they set them up and it gets even worse and worse. And that's what the flow chart was showing us at the first class is as we're progressing through these judges, you can see Israel's culture is getting worse and worse. And so the Lord gets angry with them, right? And he delivers them into the hands of their enemy. Jumping up to verse 7, it says, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. So we see here 2 people groups, the Ammonites and the Philistines. Do you know where the Ammonites come from? Yes, over here in the east. But do you know kind of their genealogy, if you will?
They're descendants of Lot.
I'm sorry, say it again. Lot. Yes, I believe that's correct. Can I see this? Yes, that is correct. So they are actually some of their more distant cousins. Now, if you know the story of Lot there in Genesis, you remember the 2 daughters that Lot had. And you know how the story goes. Would anybody like to recount the story for us? Or?
Yeah.
Yes, all right, thank you.
I mean, goes, I can talk about that. Lot, you know, his wife got turned to salt, and so there he was. And they were saying, we have no leaders. And so they went into their father,
Yeah.
and had these children, which of course is
Mhm.
incest is a great theory.
Mhm.
And so these kids were almost cursed to begin with.
Mhm.
And so that's who they are. Their descendants were brought through his own daughter.
Yeah. So if you remember the story in Lot, with Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's wife was the one who looked back when God had said don't. And so because she looked back, now the wife is gone, and the people wanted new leaders to follow after Lot. And so the wife, say, well, guess what? Dad is drunk at night. He won't know a thing. And so they go in and they sleep with their father, which is what the text writes. And so we have the Ammonites that come from that. And so this is where the people group come from. So from their very conception, there is sin involved and incest. And so this is where this people begin from. And so God says to them, he became angry and said, let's see here, they oppressed them for 18 years. So they had 45 years of peace and prosperity, and then they had 18 years of oppression, which was similar to Gideon with the Moabites, right?
Mhm.
And so for 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. And so the Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. Israel was in great distress. And so what we learn is that it eventually starts on this border here, right? They get into here, but then eventually they start to migrate and oppress the people group of Ephraim, Judah, and I believe it was Simeon as well. Benjamin, Ephraim, and Judah, some of the three strongest tribes. And also it's interesting because the introduction here of the Philistines is something that's important, because when we see the Philistines attacking, the Philistine people typically are going to come from the sea because they're seafaring people. So it's interesting that the writer is drawing our attention to an eastward attack and then also from a westward attack along the sea. And so what we actually see is that when Samson comes along, Samson's big fight is against the Philistines. But the author here is also doing something as well, because it's the continuation of the story. Some scholars believe that because the Philistines are mentioned only once in all of this story, when the writer says that God delivered them into the hands of the Philistines, and not again until the time of Samson, there is no introduction of the Philistines in the story of Samson to say the Philistines came from here and began to oppress the people. It's a continuation. And so because of that, they think the author is using the Philistines here to introduce them into the story. And we look at Jephthah and how he fights the Ammonites. And then next we will look at Samson and how he fights the Philistines. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was pretty cool. And so for 18 years they were oppressed. And they crossed the Jordan to fight Judah. And there they were fighting Ephraim, Judah as well. And so notice here in verse 10, it says, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, we have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals. But look how God replies. He says, when the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Sidonians, Amalekites, and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried to help me, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods. So I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you are in trouble. This is pretty different, right? This is new experience, right? God does remind the people every time they cry out of how he saved them before. Remember in Gideon, it was the prophet. Remember in chapter 2 and 3, it was the angel that came. And so God literally in this story is washing his hands of the Israelites. And he says, and go and ask your new gods for help. Wiersbe says on page 112, if you look at page 112, I love what Wiersbe writes here. And I'll read it for us. He said, the greatest judgment God can send to his people is to let them have their own way and not interfere. The greatest judgment God can send to his people is to let them have their own way and not interfere. Yes, ma'am.
Was this the only time God told his people that he wouldn't help them?
In the book of Judges, I'm trying to recall, there may have been one other place. Actually, no, remember with the story of Gideon, he had told them, let your God go out and save you. No, sorry, I got that wrong. Gideon had told that to the Baal worshippers. He said, if your God truly is a God, then let them go and save you. But I think in the story of Judges, this is the first time we see it.
That kind of surprised me when I read that.
Yeah.
That God just told them no, because he always was there for them. Of course, he changed his mind later, but still, to him, I just can't imagine God telling him no.
That's true. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. When they talk about this oppression that occurs for X number of years here and there, and I'm not real sure, I've got the movie version of what oppression looks like. But when you oppress somebody for 40 years, are they being beaten? Are they enslaved? They have no families because they're being. What did their oppression actually look like? Was it just economics, so they just couldn't get ahead?
Right.
What did it look like? Do you know?
The author doesn't say in this text, but knowing the culture in that day, what oppression may look like is women may be taken for men's pleasures, so people in the army or the king. It could mean that children could go and work in the fields to be the labor force for the economy. It could be where we saw with Gideon and the Moabites, they come and they take everything, the grain, the cattle, the people. It could be that certain cities are burned down because they are fighting back. So oppression could have many multiple forms of, there are multiple forms of what oppression can look like. So.
Well, one of the things that I've wondered about is during this time of oppression, they managed to get a leader together who gets an army together, which tells me they've got some freedom. Right?
I mean, in a way, even during, so I'll tell you from my experience. So I am an African American male. And so when we're telling the story of my ancestors and how they were enslaved and how they were oppressed, one of the things that we talk about is you can oppress my body, but you would never oppress my mind. So you can take my body from me, but you can never take my mind. And one of the things that we try to draw attention to is that for the religious, first of all, the slaves that were brought over from a very religious country or a religious area. So Africans in general are very religious people. And during that time, they still were. And so when scholars began to look at what part of our Africanness or our African culture did we retain from Africa when we became slaves, because we lost our culture, we lost our rights, we lost our freedom, etc. One of the things that they said is we never lost our spirit. And so if you notice how some Black churches today worship, and the preaching style and the worship style and the singing, etc., it's a reflection of some African churches and how they worship as well. And so I'm saying that to say when you bring up freedom, they still have freedom. That probably is true, because they may have been oppressed physically with their bodies being broken, taken advantage of, made to be labor force, etc. But some of them probably still knew their value, or some of them probably still had a voice inside of their head. Some of them probably still knew who their God was, which is what Jephthah tells us, because he recounts, right, to the enemy the story of Israel. And so even though they may not have had certain freedoms, some of them probably still had a freedom of mind. So I hope that helps. So then we see, let's see, what part are we in here? So God says to them, right, the greatest judgment, Wiersbe makes this, the greatest judgment God can send to his people is to let them have their own way and not interfere. And when I think about this, I'm not a parent, but one of the things that my grandmother used to say about me, or not about me, but just saying in general, was that a hard head makes a soft bobo, right? Yeah, you see, a hard head makes a soft bobo, so eventually you'll learn. So if you're not going to learn from teaching and somebody trying to counsel you through it, etc., you want to go off and do your own thing, it makes for a hard learning experience. And so some of the things that I kind of thought about is eventually people who are liars, right? They continue to lie and to lie. Eventually they are caught in their lie. The prideful person eventually is brought down and is devastated, and things of that nature. And so it's interesting though, because the way that Israel responds to the Lord is that they say to him, after he says, I will no longer save you, they say, you know what, God, we have sinned. Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now. Even in that, they're still so focused on the existential crisis, as I talk about, or in their day-to-day life, that they don't care what God does. It's like, all right, guys, just do what you do what God does, but help me right now. And so they then got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, and he could bear Israel's misery no longer. That there in verse 16 is a true sign of repentance. They ask for forgiveness, but then they remove what has caused them contention with Christ, or with God, sorry. And sometimes I think that's what God wants us to do as well. We ask for help, or we ask for deliverance, but we still keep those idols inside of our own hearts, in our own minds and life, that cause contention with God. And so it's almost like the person who, let's just say, I don't know, for lack of a better story, the person who is alcohol dependent, and they ask God for help, and they cry out to God all the time. And it's a difficult battle. It's a really difficult battle. But sometimes what that person does is they have to throw out all the bottles out the house. They have to get it all out the way. And then it helps them along the path. And sometimes that's the way we have to do, right? And that's why fasting is important. Because in the act of fasting, we're saying, God, I'm giving up this, whether it's social media, whether it's Netflix or Hulu or The Bachelor, right? Whatever it is, we can take that and we say we're going to throw it out to help us focus more on you. Now, I brought up alcohol dependence. Some things are more different and difficult, right? Because that type of struggle is not the same as I can't cut off the television because I really love America's Next Top Model, right? So yeah, The Walking Dead or any of those things. So it's different, but for some of us, we really do have to be careful to throw out the things that cause the contention. And so God says he could bear Israel's misery no longer. And so we see here the change in their condition is actually not because of their plea or repentance, but it's honestly because of God's compassion. So it's not their works, right? So it's not a work salvation. It's not, oh, because I did X, Y, and Z, God has saved me. But it's always and always will be God's compassion that leads us to salvation. And so that's where we see God say, I've had enough. I can't watch you suffer anymore. You've thrown them out. You've gotten rid of things. Even when I want to turn my back on you, I just can't. And that's because God loves us so much. And the New Testament even picks up on that to say God loved us so much that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whoever will believe will have life and life more abundantly. God's such a loving God. And so after we read that, we see then that the Ammonites were called to arms, and they camped in Gilead, and the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. Now, Mizpah here, some scholars will say they know exactly where it is. Others will say we have no clue at all, because the language there could just refer to some type of tower. However, what some people think is, if you have your map with you, there's a river that runs here. It's kind of hard to see, but right above the name God runs here, and so they think Mizpah is in this particular area. And it's interesting because what we'll see is some parallels that occur from Shechem being a symbolic city in the story of Abimelech, and Mizpah being a symbolic city or important city in the story of Jephthah. And so they gathered there, and the leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, "Whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who live in Gilead." Now, this isn't just any type of statement, right? They're not just saying you're going to be the commander of the army, but you'll be the commander moving forward. And so Wiersbe says on page 113, Israel had an army, but they didn't have a general. And so this connects to his earlier point, whether a nation or a local church, the absence of qualified leader is often a judgment of God and evidence of the low spiritual level of the people. How do you feel about that statement? Whether a nation or a local church, the absence of qualified leaders is often a judgment of God and evidence of the low spiritual level of the people. Yes, ma'am.
I think, and that's when I think of when my kid went off to college, I left it up to them to find churches, what kind of church to belong to. And I told him, I said, I'm not saying you have to be Methodist, I know that's how I raised you. I said, but I need you to be very sound in learning what is being taught there and to listen to what the pastor has to say. And if it's not sound, then you're kind of wasting your time there. And,
right.
and if that's, even if it's a very active church and very charismatic church, if it's not in the proper direction, then they're all going in the wrong direction altogether. And so I think we have to be very, very discerning in listening. And so I would make a point of when they found a church, I'd go up and go to Sunday service with them. Not that I would do the judgment call, and my thing was just asking them afterwards about the message and what had been said. And I think, a leader that's very good in their intentions and godly and going to everything, then those people will be led in that path. But I think if a leader has self-fulfilling intentions, then you're basically following him or her in their journey of self-fulfillment. And I think that's in anything we do. I mean, you got to see that leader. And I think it's just like God said here. Well, if that's what you want, follow it. I'm not, you have free will. You can do what you want. But if you follow that, then welcome to it. So it's just a call.
The old saying, you get the government that you deserve. Yeah, it's kind of the same thing there. If you're following leaders who
right.
you promise everything in the world and then you go along with it, well, then you got what you got. Why?
Yeah.
You got a leader who's gonna, and that happens. That happens in your government. It happens in your church. It happens in anything that you get into. You got to look at your leader because you get what you deserve. If you pick somebody that's gonna take you off and give you a bunch of poison juice. That's the same sort of idea.
Yeah.
That a leader, you need to watch what you're doing.
Right. That's so true. And that picks up on what we talked about last time with Abimelech in Jotham's parable, right? Jotham said, okay, well, all the rest of the trees didn't want a leader, so now we have a bramble bush. And so for us in the application today that's why voting is so important. We as Americans, many of us have the right to vote, and our vote counts because it enables us to select the leadership that we want in the civil arena, and then also in the local church. We have, especially here in the Methodist Church, we have certain committees in places where your voice matters, and so you can voice the concern to say, I don't like Marquise. We need to get him out of here. I'm not saying that's how anybody feels, but
You didn't know that.
we never really know. So But it's the ability and the freedom to do that that we have. And so sometimes I think what the text is reminding us is that when we don't exercise those rights to vote in the civil arena or to voice or to take a vote rather in the religious arena, then we get what we get in leadership.
Okay, let me bring it
Yes.
that around another way though. But I
Yes.
think also, we have to be careful to not make too big of expectations on our leaders. Such that no fig trees or vines or olive trees, one of the leaders, and then we end up with a bramble bush. And I think sometimes we can look to leaders to be the be all and end all of everything. And nobody can do that.
You know, the whole idea of being a leader is that there is a group. And so the best leaders are those that could identify people and begin to delegate and empower them. So the best leader has a group of people who are also leading. And that brings us back to the point that Wiersbe made last time when he said we all need to discover the gifts God has given us and then use them in the place where he puts us. And hopefully that place doesn't require too much of a sacrifice for us. Because if it is, then we'll see the olive tree say, nope, I don't want to give this many olives, etc., etc. And so it's interesting though, right? Because they say, the author introduces this idea that the leaders wanted somebody to lead them. And then he introduces us to Jephthah. And we're going to run through Jephthah a little fast because I know everybody want to get to his daughter. And so Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. That's the very first thing that we read about Jephthah. So after they asked, whoever would take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who lived in Gilead, they introduced, well, Jephthah was a mighty warrior. But his father was Gilead and his mother was a prostitute. Who does that sound like? Abimelech. Yeah, just like Abimelech. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. You are not going to get any inheritance in our family. That's because, as we talked about last time, he was a bastard child, as they would call. Very strong language, but it means that your father is the husband, but your mother is not the wife. And so you don't really get any inheritance. You're at the low end of the totem pole. And so Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. Who does that also sound like? Abimelech. It's the actual same Hebrew word for gang of scoundrels there that's used in the previous story. So it's the same kind of people, but Wiersbe doesn't call this vile terrorists. And so sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. Come, they said, be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. So he's been driven out of the land, right? And he now is going before this delegation, and they want him to be their king. And so let's see, 10:18. Just making sure my notes are correct. And so what we see here is that if you look at 10:18, depending on your translation, it may read in chapter 10, verse 18 of Judges, the leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, or it may say the leaders and princes, or it may say the rulers. So it's interesting when you look at the Hebrew, because when you compare chapter 10:18 and chapter 11:4, there are two different words that are employed. The former in chapter 10 uses language to represent the princes, the higher ups of society. They want a leader to rule over them. And when you get into chapter 11, it's more so the elders and the leaders of the town. So what scholars believe is going on is that the author is trying to communicate to us that there's a delegation that was sent to retrieve Jephthah. It wasn't all the people, it wasn't all the leaders, but it was a delegation. And so the delegation comes, and Jephthah replies to them in verse 7 when he says, didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? Right? So that doesn't that sound like life? Well, you didn't want me then, so why you want me now? Right?
Wasn't that his family that was mostly driving him out?
Yep.
And this is the townspeople?
Yep.
It seems to me it might be a different group of people.
It could be. That's a great way of reading it. Because we know that Jephthah was a Gileadite, so he's from the tribe of Gilead, and it is the same people that are trying to recruit him to be their leader. So it could be members of his family, or it could be a delegation. But anyway it goes, it still is some form of people trying to get him to come back, to say, hey man, we need you. And so he responds, didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? And this is what the elders say. They say, nevertheless, let bygones be bygones, whatever. The past is the past, it's okay, God's grace. And he says to them, nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead. Sounds pretty nice. And so Jephthah answers him, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? There's two things that he does here. This is the first time that we're seeing the activity of the Lord and what's going on in the fight. We see him giving over to the oppression, true, and telling them we're not going to save you, etc., and then God having compassion. But in this whole thing, we see that it's Jephthah who takes the initiative to say, well, what if God does do this? And then he questions, will I really be your head? And so the elders reply, the Lord is our witness, invoking the oath. We will certainly do as you say. So Jephthah then went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Again, Mizpah here is very important. And so we see after he becomes commander, he sends messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, what do you have against me that you have attacked my country? The king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah, when Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peacefully. And so instead of going to war, right, and being a hothead, Jephthah actually tries to be more of a wise strategist. No need for war. Let's just see if we can settle this thing because it doesn't make sense for it. And so Wiersbe breaks up his letter into 4 sections. He says he presented the facts of his history, which is that Jephthah knew his history and the story of God and his people. He was able to recount from Numbers and from Genesis. And he argued there that Israel didn't steal any land, but they captured it. So if their claim to owning the land was valid, then neither was Ammon because they captured it from the Moabites. So what he says is, look, if you don't think I should owe this land, then neither should you because you captured it just like we did. And we see that in Numbers 21 through 35. It kind of summarizes that story that Jephthah is referring to. And then he says, the Lord gave us this land. It was common for people in that time when going to war, they would think that the victory or defeat was because of the Lord's activity. You remember Barak when he was fighting Sisera. Sisera thought his gods had abandoned him as well as the people because the tide of war had changed. And so it is a reflection of his culture. And so Jephthah is therefore saying, if God granted us victory, who are you to take it away from us? And that kind of made me think about the question, is there something that God has promised us, that sometimes somebody or some situation is trying to take from us? Sometimes that peace, sometimes that equilibrium. But I'm trying to get to the good stuff here, y'all, because we got to talk about the man sacrificing his daughter.
Okay.
We have to talk about that. So let me try to power through this. So he says, the Lord has given the land to Israel. And then he reminds them, Israel has lived here for centuries. So, you probably could have brought up this argument 300 years ago, but we've been here for so long, it doesn't make any sense. And so then the final thing he says is that the Ammonites are actually fighting against the Lord. They're not just fighting against us, but they're fighting against the Lord. The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message Jephthah sent him. The man didn't even bother to reply. And some scholars will say he was already fighting Israel, he was already oppressing them, he was already winning, so what does he care about this new leader in Gilead? And so when the Ammonites paid no attention to the message, then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. Kind of sounds like a righteous indignation, right? It's like, all right, well, look, you don't want to listen to me, so now fine. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, and I can go to war. And so he crossed Gilead in verse 29, and Manasseh. He passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And then we read in verses 32 through 33 just his extensiveness of the war. It says that Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave him into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer to the vicinity of the Nith. As for Abel Karaman, thus Israel subdued Ammon. So essentially, he was kind of just active in this area primarily. He was really just active in this area. And so the next part that we get to is the juicy part of the story, right? The juicy part of the story. Even if we don't get to Ephraim's contention again today, I think that'll be all right. But let's talk about his vow. So in 30 through 31, verses 30 through 31, he says, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, depending on your translation, whatever or whoever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. And so then we see in verses 34 to 35 that he keeps his promise, because when Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sounds of tumbrils or tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." And she says to him, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites." So the big question in all of this is, do you think Jephthah actually sacrificed his daughter?
She did, yeah. He did.
And he says it down here at 39, he did never get out.
Yep. He did to her what he had vowed. And that draws our attention back to
Unless he's just saying he let her have 2 months of frolicking. And that's what he's referring to.
Yep.
I mean, it doesn't really specify, it doesn't carry it out. But
Yep.
Well, in the Bible, she was still a virgin when she was burned.
she could frolic without
But she don't know her family. She went out with her friends and they all had a good time together, and then she came back.
Yep.
She was still a virgin.
She's not a virgin. So the question is really interesting because in my study, there were really 3 different approaches to this text that I discovered. Wiersbe is very interesting, and it's okay to push back on commentators, but Wiersbe actually says she was never sacrificed. And for him, he couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that an innocent child could be sacrificed because of somebody else's foolishness. And so because of that, this is what he says. He says, when you look at this vow, it's couched in ambiguous terms. For instance, when I return victorious, whatever comes out of my house will be given to you. Well, he can't sacrifice unclean animals. You don't do that to God. You don't give God an unclean animal. So if it was a pig that came out or something unclean, he wasn't going to be able to sacrifice that. He picks up on this word here. He says in the Hebrew, then whoever, or depending on your translation, whatever comes out of my house, I will sacrifice. He takes this to mean that it is a masculine gender noun or conjunction. And so for him, he says that he had in mind a male person. So he's looking at the Hebrew, and I don't know Hebrew, but he believes the Hebrew says that this is masculine. And so because of that, he thinks there's a particular male person that is in mind. he also brings up, Wiersbe does, the laws against sacrificing a child. So God tells them, don't let your children pass through the fire when you go into this territory, as the Canaanites do. And we see that in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. The other thing he brings up is he says, okay, so this word is probably referring to a male person. Israel was commanded not to pass through the fire. But then also, it's doubtful that Jephthah's friends and neighbors would permit him to slay his own daughter to fulfill a vow. And he calls our attention to Saul, right? Remember when Saul made a vow to kill anybody who, I think, took something or ate something? His soldiers wouldn't let him kill his son. And so he says, people can stop other people from fulfilling their vows. He also brings up that if he did sacrifice her, he would have to do it at the tabernacle altar with the Levitical priest, which would take place at Shiloh. So he says he's going to have to travel, and somebody along the way would stop him. The other thing he brings up is you can pay the price to redeem somebody. So in Leviticus 27, we see that if you came to sacrifice an animal, or in more particular, a person, there is a charge that you can pay to not sacrifice that person, kind of venerate him, if you will. So what he argues is he never sacrificed his daughter. And what he does is he looks at a particular word. Let's see. It's not here in this translation, but he says that there's a particular word here. Let me see if I can get it in my translation. He makes the vow. Let's see. Come on, where's the vow at? Let's see. Okay. So in verse 31, if you read that, he says, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. So this translation is more from the NRSV, I believe. But when he says, and sacrifice it to the Lord as a burnt offering, he takes that word and says it can also be translated as or. So for Wiersbe, he thinks the argument really is whatever comes out of my house will be the Lord's, or I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. And so he says if we take this approach, the vow was twofold. Whatever met him when he returned home will be dedicated to the Lord if a person, or a sacrifice to the Lord if an animal. And so then he says, nowhere in the text are we told that Jephthah actually killed his daughter, or do we find anybody bewailing the girl's death. It's even hard to see the women of Israel celebrating child sacrifice instead of a dedication. Yes, Ms. Hunt?
Okay, is this just somebody who just can't stand the thought that such a thing happened? So he's looking for us to prove that it didn't. He's going to a whole lot of back and forth to prove that it didn't happen because it's so horrible you just don't want to believe it did.
Yeah. That could be.
Is what my Bible says. She said, do as you vowed.
Yeah.
And from then on, and she was a virgin at the time.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't agree with something that the Bible says, you think it's so horrible, and then you can hunt around and find a way to prove that's not really what happened.
Yeah.
You know, the devil could do that.
But I think if it was done, it would have been like Channel 2 News, bigger story. Whereas like Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and it was a whole story in the Bible, and it didn't go through.
Right.
I didn't think it was followed through because the story is not that.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, because there's not more to the story as was with Abram and Isaac, then maybe this didn't occur. Yeah. Yes, Ms. Hunt.
I agree with that, and I think God was looking for that willing heart to say, I'm willing to, this is my vow to you, Lord, I'm willing to do this. And then I also look at Hannah, who wanted so badly to have a child, that she said, I will dedicate my child to you, and basically she had, Samuel, and then gave him to the Lord to be raised by Eli, but it was like, okay, I mean, I think it's hard to think about, but I think you know, when you say I dedicate this child to the Lord, you're basically saying it's not my child. And I think that's what God was looking at what Jeff does to say, are you willing to make that vow to say that this child is really not yours, it's mine? And then I think that's what God just looks at a willing heart.
Yeah.
And he also is horrified by Abraham's story, Abraham's text. I thought, how could you do that? And I think he had to see that heart, and then the sacrifice was made for Isaac. The sacrifice was given for Isaac so that he would be sacrificed. But we saw that heart to say, okay, he's there. And I think for Hannah, as a mother, I cannot imagine if I prayed for this child for as long as she did, and then I had gone, okay, now I'm going to push his head, off to the priest they go.
Yeah.
It's like, but that was, that all she, her heart was to say, I want my child raised in the Lord. And that's what that meant for her.
Right.
And it could have possibly happened, because God was not telling him to do like Abraham told to do with his son Isaac. So maybe other stories in the Bible, other people who believe in God sacrifice humans or people important to him. But it wasn't the words of God telling, you know. He made that vow on his own, right?
Yeah, he did. He did. So after the Spirit of God came upon him, then that's when he decided to make the vow. God, whatever comes out of my house, I'm giving it to you as a burnt offering. Yes, sir, Mr. James.
Well, I mean, I guess, is he a good judge or a bad judge? Because I read some commentaries too, and it was saying that if he was rash in making that vow and he didn't have the Spirit, or he didn't rely fully on the Spirit, and he made this vow as extra security that trying to bribe God that he would win, then the truly sacrificing his daughter was a result of him not having faith or doubting. But if he didn't sacrifice, which some handful, they go both ways, then it sort of it shows he was he kept his vow, and then he gave up his only his lineage after that was the heir of everything that he had going for him, that he gave everything to God at the end because he made that vow. And then sort of the following celebrations are more of the sacrifice that she made in honoring her father's vow, as opposed to lamenting the fact that he made this bad decision. So, I mean, I guess it also this is a big deal as to how we evaluate, right? Yeah,
it really is, and it's interesting too because when he says that, Wiersbe points out she remained a virgin, which meant that she would not know the joys of motherhood and perpetuate her father's inheritance in Israel. This would be reason enough for her and her friends to spend 2 months grieving. For every daughter wanted a family, and every father wanted grandchildren to maintain the family inheritance. Now, I think that's a little overgeneralization, but maybe there is a little truth there. And so Wiersbe is really trying to argue through other biblical sources
He wants to
that she wasn't sacrificed. Yes, ma'am, Miss Hunt. No, yes, ma'am.
Well, I mean, she and the girls went into the hills and wept because she would never marry.
Yeah.
It doesn't say they went into the hills and wept because she was gonna die.
Right.
Didn't sacrifices have to be male?
I don't think so.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Usually firstborn, but I don't think male.
Born
male.
She was the only one.
Yeah, she was the only one. Yes, ma'am.
In my commentary, it said that human sacrifice was strictly forbidden in Israel. And and then it shows, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, all these different passages where it was strictly forbidden. So I think if he would have gone through with that, that would have been like a whole nother chapter in the Bible.
Right.
Because he would have gone, against something that was strictly forbidden, basically, he was killing one of God's children also.
Right.
So I think that would have been a really big thing.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think this also illustrates, as it does in other places in the Bible, that you better be very careful when you make a vow to the Lord. You better keep that vow.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. For us nowadays, we can even make vows. I swear by God I didn't, etc. Kids, your kids doing this. I did it growing up, and it offers a sense of truth to it because you say, well, you wouldn't lie on God, but in our society, you can do that, and I'm not sure if there aren't ramifications for it. I would like to argue maybe there are, but sometimes there aren't. However, in this society, if you made a vow, you had to pretty much stick to it. But Wiersbe points out that if it involved other people, they still had a right, if you will, in what happened. But it kind of reminds us of our prayer life sometimes. Like, God, I promise you, if you take me away from here, if you help me, I will get back in church. 5 months later, still haven't walked through the doors. You know, God, I promise I will pray more. I will even fast. I will even give. 5 months later, still doing the same thing. You know, but what I do want to offer us is this. So the text is a little ambiguous in what it says. So I went to the Women's Bible Commentary. Carol Newsom, if you're familiar with her as a female author, she's a feminist theologian. This is what she had to say about the story. She actually opposed that the daughter was indeed sacrificed. If you need to go, you can. It's 11. But after this, we'll kind of wrap it up. So she opposed that, you know, the daughter was actually sacrificed. She says, perhaps with talking about Jephthah and his actions, perhaps not recognizing the Spirit's presence, perhaps not satisfied with his power, perhaps driven by it, Jephthah proceeds to bargain with God. Jephthah's mark is actually also often seen as a classic case of blaming the victim. So when you look at 35, it says, 11:35, when he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. And I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." So in a way, the commentator here is saying he's victim blaming. He made the vow, it's on him, and it's not on his daughter. She goes on to say that as an unwitting victim, the daughter, though courageous and tragic, embodies the ultimate patriarchal value, that of women being submissive unto death. So she draws out this patriarchal language and culture. But she says, even though that may be the case, this daughter is no fool. The vow was most likely made in public at Mizpah, which is where, you know, he was made to be commander and leader. Then the way that she responds to her father, she even seems quite aware of the circumstances, right? In verse 36, she says, "You have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised. Now the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites." So she's kind of aware of the vow that he made, bringing up language that he didn't introduce when he first saw her. And so perhaps Jephthah, the commentator argues, made the vow for his daughter to hear so that she wouldn't run out and be the first one. So if he made a public vow, maybe he did it so she wouldn't be the first one to run out. Perhaps, maybe he wanted to sacrifice someone else like an enemy or a bodyguard. And so in running out, if that's the case, where Jephthah takes initiative to tell his daughter indirectly, "Don't run out because I'm making this vow, whatever comes out of my house, I give to God." If that's the case, then in her running out, she may be taking the place of someone else. Therefore, her action condemned his priorities and perhaps those of Israel. So if she knew of the vow, then she ran out to save somebody else. Some interpreters don't recognize her powerful initiative, but remember, it is her who takes control of the situation and not the father. So all that he says is, "My daughter, you brought this on me." And she says, "It's okay, Dad. We can get through this together." And so she chooses to take upon herself this vow. But in not wanting, in deciding to go into the hill country, she does not choose his company. She chooses to take upon herself his vow that he made, but she does not choose his company. The commentator says, the male-oriented narrator who has all along neglected to reveal the young woman's name is now concerned to tell us in verse 39 that she had never known a man, as if this somehow makes her end even more tragic. A woman reader might reply that she had known men, at least one all too well, and that is the heart of her tragedy. And so for the woman commentator, she sees this woman as a symbol of a powerful woman. She took initiative. She protected people. She took it upon herself to fulfill the ways of God, and she did so in such a way that didn't make her look like a fool, but showed how brave and courageous she was. The text doesn't really clearly tell us if she was sacrificed or not. I take it at face value to say that she was. Wiersbe argues against me because of the other reasons that are listed. We aren't supposed to sacrifice our children. That is a sin against God. If you sacrifice, you've got to take them to the temple. Somebody could have stopped him. He could have bought her from the vow, if you will, or venerated her, etc. That's what Wiersbe would say. And so he's trying to read into the text what he wants. But I like to see at least what the woman's commentary says. I like to see her as a woman who has initiative and autonomy to say, I decide today to fulfill this vow for you because I want to honor God and keep our truths. And so, again, she was sacrificed, she wasn't. All we know is that in the end, she took initiative. Yes.
And maybe women, back in the day were not read about, or history was based on maybe her death was not important as a man's death would have been, so that's why it wasn't elaborated.
Yeah.
But if you kill the man, it's going to be in the book. It's going to be in the book.
Yeah. So that's another great point. We never learned of her name, right? We even learned of the youngest son of Gideon named Jotham, who pronounced his name, but we never learned of this woman's name. Right. And it's a patriarchal society, so maybe they didn't care about the story and what became of it, and they left it there.
The Bible says they celebrated 4 days a year.
Yeah.
The women did, right?
Yeah, they celebrated it. But this is the only place we see that in Scripture. Yes, ma'am.
I found it kind of interesting because women were just not even looked at, they were much more than cattle back then.
Right.
So why was this so important except that he made this vow? So maybe he knew that his daughter was going to come out and she wasn't worth anything because she wasn't a male.
Yeah. Maybe that is the case. Maybe he knew she was cattle, she wasn't worth anything, so she comes out, she comes out.
I just can't believe God would let him sacrifice his daughter.
Right. It's difficult when we look at the Old Testament because the ethics of society are different. It's the same God.
But it also goes against the Ten Commandments.
In some ways, you can argue that. In some ways, you can argue that. The last point I want to bring up before I pray is this. Okay. We didn't talk about Ephraim and their fight against the Gileadites or Jephthah. You can read about that a little later. And you also know that when you see certain signs like people had donkeys, etc., or they married outside the clan, they were probably wealthy. So you can read that with the 3 minor judges. The last thing I want to mention is that in all of this that happens, we only really see and read about God's activity in the battle. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah, and it's all that we read about God's activity. And so what I love, hopefully it was Dr. Newsom. She used to be a professor, I think, at Candler, but which was my seminary. She writes, or the other woman here, Sharon Ringe, they write, Yahweh in this story, we only see him come up when Israel is oppressed and they cry out, they throw away their idols. And then he says, I'll raise up a deliverer. And then when he presents the story, Jephthah presents the history, God's Spirit comes upon them and God delivers them. But the author doesn't write anything else about the activity of God. And because of that, the commentator says, Yahweh is merely another party to be bargained with. And once the victory is granted to Jephthah and Gilead, to be dispensed with like the daughter. So I just want to let you sit with that. And I'll close this with prayer. God, we thank you so much for this study. Went through 3 chapters today, God. That's a lot. And we didn't cover everything. But it does strike us sometimes when we read your word because we don't agree with some of it. We can't really see how somebody could sacrifice their only daughter when there were other options. Your text doesn't tell us that that happens, but we have to sometimes take the text at face value. We want to be careful not to read into your word. But God, however we feel about it, it still hurts us to know what became of her. And sometimes, God, in this story, we find ourselves just like the Israelites bargaining with you. God, if you do X, Y, and Z, I promise I will do X, Y, and Z. God, if you deliver me in this way, if you show up in my life in this way, if you heal me from this, if you provide financial blessing for this, if you can help me with my retirement, if you can help me get my home, etc., etc., then I will do this. And so, God, so many times we try to bargain with you. May you forgive us of that. May you help us to remember that we can't bargain with salvation because salvation was already bought at the cost of your Son's life. And it is a gift that is freely given to us for eternity. All we simply have to do is to toss out the idols in our life, the idols that we as Americans hold so dear. Throw them out the door in order to fully see you and to follow you. And so as we depart from this place, may you walk with us. May you minister to our spirit. May you take us deeper into the process of sanctification. And may you help us to never, ever, ever dispense you like the daughter in this story. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.